The clock ticked relentlessly as the office buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy, coffee mugs clinking, keyboards tapping, and conversations flowing in hushed tones. It was another day at one of the city's busiest marketing agencies. But for one employee, this morning was different. She stepped into the building with her heart racing, her palms slightly damp as she clutched her bag. The air felt heavier than usual, and a single question swirled in her mind. Would today be the day they finally let her go? For months, whispers had been circulating about her tardiness. Late arrivals, missed meetings, excuses that felt increasingly weak to her coworkers. She had become the subject of office gossip. Some said she was careless, others thought she was struggling with personal issues. Few, if any, knew the truth. What they didn't see were the sleepless nights, the constant juggling, and the sacrifices she made just to keep her life from crumbling completely. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When she started at the company 2 years ago, she was a rising star, sharp, innovative, and full of energy. Her ideas turned heads, her presentations won clients, and she quickly gained the respect of her peers. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and for her, they came fast and hard. It all began with a family emergency, a situation so dire she couldn't ignore it, no matter the consequences. Days turned into weeks, and before she knew it, her once perfect attendance record was marred by late arrivals. At first, her manager was understanding. "Take the time you need," they said. But patience, especially in a competitive workplace, has its limits. The turning point came last Friday during the team's weekly review meeting. She arrived 10 minutes late, breathless, her face flushed with panic. The room fell silent as she slipped into her seat. The manager's expression was unreadable, but everyone could sense the tension. The meeting continued, but the air was thick with judgment. She could feel the stares, hear the unspoken criticism in the back of her mind. That afternoon, she received an email summoning her to a meeting with HR. The subject line alone sent a chill down her spine: performance review discussion. She knew what it meant. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation about her goals or growth within the company. It was the beginning of the end, or so she thought. Over the weekend, she barely slept. She replayed every mistake, every late arrival, every excuse she had made. Part of her wanted to give up, to walk away before they could fire her. But another part of her, the part that had fought so hard to get where she was, refused to back down. As she walked into the HR office on Monday morning, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The room was small and cold, with a single table and a few chairs. Her manager was already seated, alongside the HR representative. They greeted her politely, but there was a formality in their tone that made her stomach twist. "We've called this meeting to address some ongoing concerns," the HR rep began. "Your recent performance, specifically your punctuality, has been impacting the team. We need to discuss next steps." Her heart sank. She wanted to explain, to pour out the truth about everything she'd been dealing with. But would they even care? She hesitated, her mind racing for the right words. And then it happened. Instead of breaking down or pleading for another chance, she did something no one in that room expected. With a calm but determined voice, she began to tell her story, the real story. She spoke about the challenges she had been facing, the responsibilities she couldn't walk away from, and the sacrifices she had made just to show up every day. Her voice cracked at times, but she didn't stop. By the time she finished, the room was silent. The manager leaned back in their chair, their expression unreadable. The HR rep glanced at the notes they had been taking but said nothing. For a moment, it felt like the verdict was already decided. But then, she did something even more unexpected. She pulled out a folder she had prepared over the weekend, a detailed plan outlining how she intended to turn things around. It included everything from adjusting her schedule to setting up backup plans for emergencies. She even proposed new ideas for the team, showcasing her commitment to not just meeting expectations but exceeding them. The room shifted. What started as a tense meeting with a seemingly inevitable conclusion turned into something entirely different. But that's where this part of the story ends for now. Because what happened next didn't just change her career. It changed the way everyone in that office saw her. And it's a story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about resilience, redemption, and the power of never giving up. So, if you think you know how this ends, think again. As she sat there, waiting for their response, the silence stretched on longer than she expected. Her manager's eyes remained fixed on the folder in front of them, flipping through the pages as if weighing every word she had written. The HR representative, a stern-faced woman who seemed to have perfected the art of neutrality, finally broke the silence. "This is comprehensive," she said, her tone measured. "But we need to determine if it's enough to address the core issue." Her manager finally looked up, their expression softer than it had been at the start of the meeting. "I'll admit," they began, "this shows effort. A lot of effort. But this isn't just about plans or intentions. It's about results. How can we trust that things will actually change?" The question lingered in the air, and for a moment she felt her resolve waver. Could they trust her? After everything that had happened, did she even trust herself? But instead of backing down, she leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "I know I've let the team down," she admitted. "And I take full responsibility for that. But I'm asking for a chance, a real chance to prove that I can do better. I'm not asking for a free pass. Hold me accountable. Give me a timeline, set clear expectations, and if I don't meet them, then you won't need to fire me. I'll step down myself." The room went quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the kind of silence that came from judgment or tension. It was thoughtful, almost contemplative. She could feel the shift, subtle as it was. "Let's take a moment," the HR representative said, signaling her manager to step outside. As they left the room, she sat alone, the ticking of the wall clock the only sound in the cold, sterile space. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Had she said enough? Had she said too much? Every moment of self-doubt clawed at her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She thought back to how everything had spiraled so quickly. It wasn't just one thing, it was a series of events that had piled on top of each other like a stack of precariously balanced dominoes. It started with her mom's health scare, a sudden and unexpected diagnosis that turned their world upside down. Doctor's appointments, hospital stays, late nights spent researching treatments. It consumed her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. But that wasn't all. At the same time, her younger brother, barely out of college, had found himself in trouble, struggling to find a job and burdened with debt. She had stepped in to help, taking on more financial and emotional weight than she could handle. Then there was her own life, her own dreams, and the crushing pressure of trying to balance it all without letting anyone down. She had tried to keep her struggles private, telling herself that she didn't want pity or special treatment. But in doing so, she had isolated herself, leaving others to assume the worst. Now, as she sat in that cold room, she realized just how much she had underestimated the importance of letting people in, of asking for help when it was needed most. When her manager and the HR representative returned, their expressions gave nothing away. She straightened in her chair, bracing herself for whatever came next. "We've reviewed your plan," the HR rep began, "and we've decided to give you a probationary period. 3 months. During this time, we'll evaluate your progress based on the criteria you've outlined here." Her manager chimed in. "This isn't just about showing up on time. We need to see consistency in your work, your communication, and your overall contribution to the team. If you can meet those expectations, we'll reassess at the end of the probationary period." Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't a victory, it was an opportunity, one she couldn't afford to waste. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't let you down." As she left the meeting room, a mix of emotions coursed through her: relief, determination, and a lingering fear of failure. But above all, she felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could turn this around. What she didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Back at her desk, she noticed the glances from her coworkers, some curious, others skeptical. The whispers hadn't stopped; if anything, they had grown louder. She could feel their eyes on her as she powered up her computer, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. She ignored them, focusing instead on her to-do list. The probation period had officially begun, and every minute counted. But as the day went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It started small: an email she sent that didn't receive a reply, a meeting invite she wasn't included in. At first, she brushed it off as coincidence. But as the days turned into weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She was being iced out, deliberately excluded from key conversations and decisions. She tried to address it directly, asking her manager about missed meetings and unreturned messages, but the answers were vague, evasive. "It's just a busy time," they said. "Don't take it personally." But how could she not? It was clear that some people didn't believe she deserved this second chance, and they were determined to make her feel it. The more she tried to prove herself, the more obstacles seemed to appear in her path. Projects she had worked tirelessly on were reassigned without explanation. Her ideas were dismissed in meetings, only to be brought up later by someone else and suddenly praised. It was infuriating, but she refused to let it break her. Instead, she channeled her frustration into action, working harder and smarter than ever before. She stayed late, double-checking every detail, anticipating questions before they were asked. She volunteered for projects no one else wanted, determined to show her value. But as the probation period wore on, she began to notice something strange: little inconsistencies that didn't add up. Emails with key information were mysteriously missing from her inbox. Deadlines she swore she had met were suddenly changed, making it look like she had failed to deliver. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there: a pattern of sabotage that threatened to unravel everything she was working so hard to rebuild. And as she dug deeper, piecing together the clues, she realized that someone in the office wanted her to fail. As the days turned into weeks, the invisible forces working against her became harder to ignore. She started keeping meticulous notes, documenting every interaction, every missed email, every sudden shift in deadlines. At first, she thought it might be paranoia. After all, the stress of proving herself during the probation period was enough to make anyone hyper-aware. But the more she observed, the more certain she became. Someone, or perhaps more than one person, was actively trying to undermine her. The realization left her shaken but also strangely resolved. Whoever it was, they weren't going to win. Her first clue came during a routine check of her calendar. She noticed a meeting scheduled with a client she had been working closely with. But her name wasn't on the invite. Confused, she approached the colleague listed as the organizer, someone she had always considered friendly, even supportive. "Hey, I noticed the meeting with the Clarion team," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "I've been handling most of their campaign strategy. Shouldn't I be in that discussion?" Her colleague looked up from their computer, their expression a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't quite place. "Oh, I thought you were busy with other projects," they said, their voice light but unconvincing. "I didn't want to bother you." Her stomach tightened. It was such a small thing, easy to brush off as a misunderstanding, but it didn't sit right. She forced a smile, masking her frustration. "Thanks for thinking of me, but I'd like to join if that's okay. I can bring some of the latest data insights I've been working on." "Sure," they said, though their hesitation was clear. The meeting itself went smoothly, but the incident stuck with her. It was becoming increasingly clear that someone wanted her out of the loop. Why? As she mulled over the possibilities, her mind drifted to the office dynamics she had once overlooked. Every workplace had its politics, its alliances and rivalries, but she had never paid much attention to them until now. There was the senior analyst who had always seemed annoyed by her ambition, the project manager who bristled whenever her ideas gained traction in meetings, and even the HR rep who had seemed almost too eager to put her on probation. It could be any of them or none. But the thought that someone was actively working against her made her feel like a stranger in her own office. One evening, as she stayed late to finish a report, she noticed a shadow pass by her desk. She looked up, startled, but the office was empty. Shrugging it off, she turned back to her work, only to find that her document had suddenly closed itself. System update. Read a pop-up notification on her screen. Her heart sank. When she reopened the file, half her work was gone. She tried not to panic, frantically searching through autosave versions, but the most recent edits were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had never existed. The frustration bubbled up, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. This wasn't just bad luck. It couldn't be. The next day, she mentioned the issue to IT, framing it as a technical glitch. The tech support specialist, a kind and detail-oriented person, promised to look into it. By the end of the day, they had an answer, but it wasn't the one she expected. "It looks like someone accessed your account remotely last night," they said, frowning at the logs. They didn't leave much of a trace, but it's clear they were poking around. "Have you shared your password with anyone?" She shook her head, her mind racing. Someone had gone to the trouble of accessing her account to erase her work. This wasn't just office politics anymore, it was sabotage. "Can you tell who it was?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. The tech specialist hesitated. "Not directly. But whoever it was used a device connected to our internal network. That means it had to be someone in the office." Her suspicions deepened. She thanked them for their help and returned to her desk, her thoughts swirling. She began to scrutinize every interaction, every sideways glance, every offhand comment. It was exhausting, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. At the same time, she knew she couldn't confront anyone without evidence. To protect herself, she started backing up her work on a secure drive, changing her passwords, and double-checking everything before submitting it. But the constant vigilance took its toll. She was tired, not just physically but emotionally, and the weight of proving herself while dealing with this unseen threat was almost too much to bear. Outside of work, she found herself withdrawing from friends and family, too drained to explain what was happening. Even when her best friend called to check in, she kept the conversation surface level, unwilling to share the full extent of her struggles. But one night, as she sat alone in her apartment, staring at her laptop screen, she realized she couldn't keep going like this. If she wanted to survive not just the probation period but the relentless pressure of her situation, she needed to figure out who was behind it all. Her first step was to revisit her interactions with colleagues, looking for patterns. She combed through old emails, meeting notes, and project timelines, searching for any inconsistencies or red flags. Slowly but surely, a picture began to emerge. It wasn't just one person. It was a small group, working together to undermine her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. These were people she had trusted, colleagues she had collaborated with on countless projects. The betrayal stung, but it also fueled her determination. She wouldn't let them win. She started laying her own traps, subtle ways to test her theories and gather evidence. In one meeting, she deliberately mentioned a fictional deadline for an upcoming project, only to see it mysteriously change in an email sent later by one of her suspected saboteurs. In another instance, she inserted a small but intentional error in a draft she shared, only to have it highlighted and exaggerated in a team review. Each incident confirmed what she already knew. Someone was out to get her, and they were getting bolder. But as the pieces of the puzzle came together, she realized that exposing them wouldn't be enough. She needed to do more than survive this probation period. She needed to reclaim her reputation and show everyone in that office exactly who she was. The days that followed were filled with a constant, gnawing tension. The sense of being watched, of being sabotaged, intensified with every passing hour. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from falling. But she couldn't stop now. She was too close to uncovering the truth, and there was no way she was going to back down. Every decision she made became a calculated move. When the next team meeting rolled around, she made sure to stay sharp, her every word measured, her every response deliberate. She had learned to read between the lines, catching small moments of discomfort from the people who were working against her, an exchange of glances, a hurried response, the subtle shift in body language when her name came up in conversation. She began to keep track of their behavior, noting their actions when they thought no one was watching. It was in the way one colleague, who had always been friendly to her, would conveniently forget to send an email or leave out crucial details in project discussions. Another would casually drop a comment, making it sound like they had done her a favor by helping her with a task that she had actually completed on her own. It was petty, juvenile, but it was also a systematic attempt to discredit her, to make her seem incompetent in the eyes of the team. But as she prepared to confront these subtle attacks, she noticed something else, a strange shift in the office atmosphere. Whispers seemed to grow louder, and there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. Colleagues, who had once been indifferent to her, began treating her with an awkward politeness, as if they had all suddenly become aware of her fragile position. It wasn't just her. There was something larger at play, something that had been quietly brewing beneath the surface. The more she observed, the more she realized that the sabotage wasn't just about her failure. It was about something bigger, something that involved more than just a handful of disgruntled coworkers. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, trying to stay focused despite mounting pressure, she overheard a conversation in the break room. Two of her colleagues were talking in hushed tones, unaware that she was within earshot. "If she doesn't get her act together, we're all going to be in trouble," one of them said. "She won't last much longer." "Not with the way things are going," the other replied, the tone laced with a hint of satisfaction. Her heart raced. She couldn't help but listen in, her mind desperately trying to piece together what they were saying. It was clear now this wasn't just personal animosity. There was a collective effort to push her out, to break her down so that she would leave without a fight. But she wasn't about to give them satisfaction. The thought of walking away, of letting them win, was unbearable. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into palms of her hands. She was going to find out who was behind this, and she was going to expose them. That evening, as the office grew quieter and the hum of conversation faded, she decided it was time to act. She went back to the files she had been reviewing earlier that day, looking for anything that could give her the leverage she needed. The stakes were higher than ever, and if she didn't uncover the truth soon, her career, her entire future could be over. But as she dug deeper, her stomach churned. The documents she had been working on had been tampered with again. Files had gone missing, emails were deleted, and everything she had worked so hard for seemed to be slipping further and further out of her control. It was as if someone was methodically erasing her presence from company, making her invisible in a place where she had once been vital. The feeling of being hunted crept in again, colder and sharper this time. The sabotage had escalated from petty tricks to something more calculated, more dangerous. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to ruin her, they were trying to destroy everything she had built. Her breath came faster as her mind raced through the possibilities. The stakes had changed. This wasn't just about surviving her probation anymore. It was about survival, pure and simple. If she didn't act now, she could lose everything: her job, her reputation, the life she had worked so hard to build. She locked the door to her office, pulled out her phone, and began making a list of her suspects. But as she typed, a message flashed across her screen: "We need to talk." It was from one of the people she had suspected, someone she had thought was on her side. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this a trap? Was it a final attempt to push her over the edge, to make her think she had allies when she didn't? Or was it genuine? She took a deep breath and replied, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed, "Where?" The response came almost immediately: "Tonight. The rooftop. Don't bring anyone." A sense of dread settled over her as she stared at the screen. It was too late to back out now. Whatever game they were playing, she was already too deep into it. She left the office as quickly as she could, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Who had reached out to her? What did they want? What were they planning? She could feel eyes of the office on her, but she ignored them, walking with purpose through the dimly lit streets. The rooftop was deserted when she arrived, the cold night air biting at her skin. She waited in the silence, every nerve on edge, watching for any sign of movement. The city stretched out beneath her, the distant hum of traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. And then, she saw them. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by a hood. They approached slowly, the tension in the air thickening with every step they took. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low but steady, trying to mask the fear that had started creeping up her spine. The figure stopped just a few feet away, lowering the hood to reveal a familiar face. It was someone she had trusted, someone who had once been her biggest ally. Her breath caught in her throat. And just as she opened her mouth to speak, the figure held up a hand, signaling for silence. "You're not alone in this," they said quietly. "But you need to be careful. There are more people involved than you think." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The ground beneath her feet felt suddenly unstable, and she knew that what came next would change everything. But before she could ask another question, the figure turned and disappeared into the night, leaving her standing on rooftop with more questions than answers. As the figure disappeared into the shadows, her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She stood there, the cold night air biting at her skin, and for a long moment she couldn't move. The words echoed in her head, "There are more people involved than you think." What did that even mean? More people? Who could be involved? And why would someone she had trusted say something like that, then vanish without answering her questions? She pulled her jacket tighter around her, the chills suddenly overwhelming her. The tension that had been building inside her over the past weeks now felt unbearable. Every minute she stood there was a minute wasted. She had to act. But how could she move forward without knowing who was on her side? Or who was playing her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. She pulled it out of her pocket, expecting another cryptic message from the mysterious figure, but instead, it was an email from her boss. The subject line read, "Immediate meeting tomorrow morning, come prepared." Her heart skipped a beat. What could this be about? Had her cover been blown? Was this the end? She tried to steady her breathing as she read the message. The urgency in the tone was unmistakable, but it wasn't an accusation. It was more like a challenge. Come prepared. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to prepare for, but she knew it couldn't be good. A sinking feeling in her stomach grew with each passing second. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was she going to be fired? Was this the final step in the elaborate game someone had been playing with her all along? She didn't have answers. But she knew one thing: she couldn't go into that meeting unprepared. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she would be ready. The night before the meeting, she stayed up late, going over everything she had learned. The sabotage. The small tricks. The whispers in the office. She knew she was close to uncovering the full extent of what was happening, but something still didn't add up. The message from the rooftop lingered in her mind. There are more people involved than you think. Who were these people, and why had they decided to target her? Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. She looked down, startled to see a text message from the same number that had sent the cryptic rooftop message, "The meeting tomorrow. It's a setup. Be careful." Her breath caught in her throat. A setup? What was going on? Was the meeting with her boss really what it appeared to be, or was this a trap? She felt a wave of panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Whoever was behind this knew she was getting closer to the truth. They had to. And if they were trying to set her up, it meant she was onto something big. The next morning, she arrived at the office early. The usual hum of activity was absent, and the building felt unnervingly quiet. She walked into the conference room where the meeting was scheduled, her stomach tight with anticipation. Her boss was already there, sitting at the head of the table, a look of deep concentration on their face. The room felt charged, as if something was about to happen, but no one was willing to say it out loud. "Good morning," her boss said, their voice low and clipped. "We need to have a serious conversation." Her pulse quickened. She had been prepared for an interrogation, but the way her boss said it, with such weight in their tone, made her feel like the ground was slipping out from under her. Was this the moment everything would unravel? Before she could speak, the door to the conference room opened, and 2 other senior managers entered. Her heart skipped. She recognized one of them immediately, the same colleague who had been so elusive with information and who had always seemed to be a bit too friendly, a bit too eager to help when she didn't need it. The other was a manager who had always seemed indifferent to her work, but who had recently started showing an unusual level of interest. Why were they both here? It felt like a trap was closing in on her, and she was the prey. "We've been reviewing your performance," her boss began, their eyes narrowing. "And we have concerns. Serious concerns." Her chest tightened. Her mind raced. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could get a word out, the manager who had been overly friendly with her cut in. "Frankly, we've been hearing a lot of complaints from the team," they said, their voice almost too smooth, too practiced. "And there's been some concern about your reliability." A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. "Complaints? What complaints?" She had no idea what they were talking about. It was all lies. The sabotage. The manipulation. It was all coming together now, and it was clear they were trying to paint her as incompetent, as a liability. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her boss held up a hand. "We've been reviewing everything," they said, their voice now hard. "Your work, your interactions with the team. And frankly, there's a lot of evidence that doesn't add up." Her head spun. Evidence? What evidence? They were all talking in circles, but none of it made sense. This wasn't about her work. It was about something else, something far deeper than simple performance issues. And then, just as she thought she might crack under the pressure, the second plot twist hit. Her phone buzzed again, and she quickly glanced at the screen. It was a video message marked urgent. The sender was unknown. Without thinking, she clicked it open. The video was short, but it felt like time stood still as she watched it. There on the screen was her supposed ally from the rooftop. But they weren't alone. Behind them was a shadowy figure, barely visible, but enough to make her stomach drop. It was someone from her team, someone she had worked with closely. And they were both talking about her. "What she doesn't know is we've already won," the person from her team said, their voice low but unmistakable. "Once she's out, we're in. She'll never see it coming." The message ended abruptly, and the screen went black. Her mind went into overdrive. What was happening? She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Her own team was turning on her. But this wasn't just about her job. It was about a network, a conspiracy that she had barely begun to unravel. Whoever had orchestrated this had planned it all along. But why? And how far would they go to make sure she didn't succeed? The meeting in front of her wasn't just about her performance. It was the beginning of a fight for her survival, and it was clear now that the stakes were higher than ever. The room felt suffocating as the video message played in her mind. It was impossible to shake the image of that shadowy figure standing behind her supposed ally, someone she had trusted completely. Her stomach churned, the weight of the betrayal settling over her like a thick fog. She had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a game she hadn't even realized was being played. But she couldn't let this defeat her. Not now. Not when she was so close. The tension in the conference room had reached its breaking point. Her boss was still talking, but she could barely focus on their words anymore. The faces of her colleagues blurred, their voices nothing more than muffled noise in her ears. All that mattered now was figuring out how to survive this and how to turn the tables. She needed to fight back, not just for her job, but for everything they had tried to take from her. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke up, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. I know what you've been doing. I know about the sabotage. The way you've been trying to frame me. The room fell silent. For a split second, she thought she might have miscalculated, but then she saw the faint flicker of surprise in her boss's eyes. It was just enough. You think you can destroy me, make me look incompetent? You're wrong, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've known for weeks. Every move you made, every lie you spread, I saw it. And I've been gathering evidence. All of it. You've been so careful, so calculated, but you never thought I'd catch on. The senior managers exchanged uneasy glances, their smug expressions faltering for just a moment. The pressure was building, and they knew it. She had them cornered. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding her system as she pulled out her phone, the video from the rooftop still fresh in her mind. You think I didn't notice? She went on. I've seen the way you've been working behind the scenes, whispering to each other, setting me up at every turn. But here's the thing, I'm not the one who's going to fall. The tension in the room was thick, almost tangible. Her boss stared at her, their face unreadable. But there was something in their eyes, something like fear, something like the realization that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated her. Then, before anyone could react, she slammed her phone onto the table. The video she had received earlier, the one with her betrayer's voice, played in full. The silence was deafening as the footage rolled, revealing the exact moment her team member had conspired against her, their words of betrayal echoing in the room. Her boss's face turned pale. The look of disbelief spread like wildfire across the room, and she couldn't help but feel a small surge of triumph. Finally, she had proof. She had what she needed to expose them all. But just as she thought she had it under control, just as the victory seemed within reach, a new voice entered the conversation. It was a voice she hadn't expected to hear. You think this is over? The voice was calm, but there was a dark edge to it. She turned to find the figure who had approached her on the rooftop standing in the doorway of the conference room. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. The person was real, standing there, eyes locked with hers. What are you doing here? She demanded, her heart sinking into her stomach. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. You think you're the only one who's been playing this game? They asked, their tone dripping with a cold satisfaction. It hit her like a punch to the gut. Another layer. Another twist she hadn't seen coming. She had thought this entire time that it was just her team, the people she worked with every day, trying to sabotage her. But this person, the one who had claimed to be her ally, wasn't just another employee, they were a part of something much bigger. You were never meant to win, the figure said, stepping into the room with a slow, deliberate pace. This was never about you. You were just a pawn. The real goal was much bigger than that. Much more important. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. What goal? What were they talking about? She had thought the whole thing was about her job, her career, but now she was beginning to realize the truth was far more sinister. The figure turned to face her boss, their expression shifting to one of superiority. I think it's time we reveal the full extent of the plan. Don't you agree? Her boss looked uncomfortable, but then something shifted in their expression, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, but it was gone too quickly for her to read it. Before anyone could react, the figure reached into their pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. They placed it on the table, sliding it over to her with a smooth motion. This is the real key to everything. The reason behind it all. You think it's just about your job, about your reputation, but it's never been that simple. She stared at the flash drive, her mind reeling. Was this some kind of final twist? Was it the last piece of the puzzle? She hesitated, but then, her curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed the drive and plugged it into her laptop, watching as a file opened on the screen. The contents made her blood run cold. The file revealed an entire network of corporate espionage, manipulation, bribery, illegal activities, and she had been right in the middle of it all. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a scheme much larger than her own office drama. The people she had trusted, the ones who had been trying to sabotage her, weren't just after her job. They were after everything. They had been manipulating not only her but other employees, feeding them lies, turning them against each other, all to cover up a massive illegal operation happening right under their noses. And the worst part? She was the one who had unknowingly been the final piece they needed to complete their scheme. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the magnitude of what she was holding in her hands. She had been played from the very beginning. But it wasn't over yet. No, now she had the upper hand. In the silence that followed, she looked up from the screen, meeting the eyes of her boss, the figure, and everyone in the room. You really thought I wouldn't find out? She asked, her voice cold, filled with a quiet fury. But the final twist came from the one person she hadn't suspected. Her supposed ally, the one who had sent the rooftop message, leaned in, a smirk playing at the corners of their lips. You really think you're the one who's been playing this game? They asked, their voice suddenly icy. You were never meant to win. And with that, everything she thought she understood, everything she thought she had gained, was called into question once more. The game had only just begun. The tension in the room was unbearable. The weight of the flash drive sat heavily in her hands, as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. She could feel the eyes of her boss, the figure from the rooftop, and the rest of the senior managers burning into her, but she didn't back down. She had come too far to let fear take over now. Her mind raced. The file had shown the depth of the conspiracy, the lengths people had gone to deceive her, manipulate her into thinking she was the target. But now she understood, she wasn't the real target. She had been a stepping stone in someone else's plan. The real danger was much bigger, and it wasn't just confined to her office. It was a massive network of corporate deceit, illegal dealings, and betrayal that spanned much further than she could have ever imagined. Her eyes flicked back to the figure, who was still smiling, but it was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. You're too late, they said softly, their words dripping with satisfaction. You really think you can take this down, just like that? But her resolve didn't waver. The files she had uncovered had given her enough ammunition to go to the authorities. She had everything she needed to blow this operation wide open. They had underestimated her, just like they had underestimated everyone who had ever been wronged by this network. And now, they were going to pay for it. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady despite the fury rising inside her. You've been using people for far too long. And you've made one fatal mistake. You underestimated me. The room fell into a heavy silence. She could see the flicker of doubt in the eyes of the senior managers, the ones who had been complicit in this whole mess. They knew now that they were on the losing side. Her boss finally spoke, their voice shaking with a mix of frustration and fear. You don't understand. You've been playing right into their hands. This isn't just about you or your job. This goes beyond us. It's bigger than anything you could ever hope to stop. But she didn't listen. She had no time for empty threats. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and now she was in control. I know exactly what this is about, she said firmly. And I'm going to make sure it ends. With a few swift moves, she transferred the contents of the flash drive to her laptop, then made a backup onto a secure cloud drive. She wasn't going to take any chances. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. She couldn't let them win, not after everything they had put her through. Before anyone could react, she stood up and walked to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the frantic murmurs behind her, but she didn't turn around. She had one goal now, to get out of there, to get to the authorities, and make sure everything she had uncovered came to light. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to look back to know who it was. The figure from the rooftop was still trailing her, still trying to play their hand. You think you've won, don't you? The figure called out, their voice echoing down the empty corridor. She stopped in her tracks, turning to face them. You've made a mistake, she said quietly, her voice unwavering. It's over. Do you think they'll believe you? The figure asked, their voice low and menacing. Do you really think you can bring all of this down? You're just one person. You'll never be able to take it all down on your own. But she wasn't alone. She knew that now. She had allies. She had the evidence. She had everything she needed to expose the truth. You're wrong, she replied calmly. I'm not alone. And you're about to find that out. With that, she walked away, leaving the figure standing there, powerless to stop her. She didn't need to look back. She knew she had won. The next few days were a blur. She went straight to the authorities, presenting everything she had uncovered: the corporate espionage, the illegal dealings, the betrayals within her own company. It didn't take long for the truth to start unraveling. The network of corruption was far-reaching, but with the evidence she had, it was impossible to deny. It was just a matter of time before the entire operation came crashing down. As she watched the news coverage unfold, her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The people who had tried to destroy her, the ones who had played her for a fool, were finally being held accountable. They had underestimated her, thought they could control her, but she had proven them wrong. The final blow came when her boss was arrested. Their face, once full of confidence and authority, was now a mask of shame and defeat. The same people who had plotted against her were now facing the consequences of their actions, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in that moment. It wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about making sure the world knew the truth, that people like her didn't have to stay silent, that they didn't have to accept being mistreated or used. She had taken control of her own destiny, and in doing so, she had exposed the rot that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. But even as the dust settled, even as the pieces of her life began to fall back into place, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The world was full of people who would try to take advantage, who would try to control the narrative. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned too much from this experience. She had learned to fight, to stand up for herself, and to trust that the truth would always come to light no matter how deeply it was buried. As she sat in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, she smiled to herself. It had been a long, difficult journey, but she had come out on top. And now, with the weight of the past behind her, she was ready for whatever came next. The lesson was clear: no one could ever underestimate her again.